The Bristol Type 156 Beaufighter is a multi-role aircraft developed during the Second World War by Bristol Aeroplane Company in the UK. It was originally conceived as a heavy fighter variant of the Bristol Beaufort bomber. The Beaufighter was a versatile aircraft used in service initially as a night fighter, and later mainly in the maritime strike and ground attack roles. It also replaced the earlier Beaufort as a torpedo bomber. Variants built in Australia by the Department of Aircraft Production were sometimes referred to by the name DAP Beaufighter. Design and development. The idea of a fighter development of the Beaufort was suggested to the Air Ministry by Bristol. The suggestion coincided with the delays in the development and production of the Westland Whirlwind cannon-armed twin-engine fighter. Bristol made proposals of a fixed four-cannon version and a turret fighter with twin cannons. The former was preferred by the Assistant Chief of the Air Staff. As a torpedo bomber and general reconnaissance aircraft, the Beaufort had moderate performance, but for fighter-like performance, Bristol suggested the new Hercules engines in place of the Beaufort's Taurus. Since the Beaufort cannon fighter was a conversion of an existing design, development and production was expected far more quickly than with a completely fresh design. Accordingly, the Air Ministry produced draft specification Air 1137 written around Bristol's suggestion for an interim aircraft pending proper introduction of the Whirlwind. Bristol started building a prototype by taking a partly built Beaufort out of the production line. This conversion served to speed the process. Bristol had promised series production in early 1940 on the basis of an order being placed in February 1939, and the ministry ordered 2 prototypes from the line and 2 built from scratch. Although it had been expected that maximum reuse of Beaufort components would speed the process, the fuselage needed more work than expected and had to be completely redesigned. As such, the first prototype flew for the first time on the 17th of July 1939, a little more than 8 months after the design had started, possibly due to the use of much of the Beaufort's design and parts. A production contract for 300 machines off the drawing board had already been placed 2 weeks before the prototype F-1739 even flew. The first prototype achieved 335 miles per hour at 16,800 feet. The second prototype, when laden with operational equipment, was slower at 309 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. Large orders were placed at the start of the Second World War, but this meant an expected shortage of Hercules engines. In February 1940, conversion of 3 aircraft to Rolls-Royce Merlins was ordered. Success with the design was expected to lead to production aircraft in 1941. The Merlin engine installations and nacelles were designed for the Beaufighter by Rolls-Royce as a complete power egg unit. The first Merlin-powered aircraft flew in June 1940. The Beaufighter Merlin installation was later incorporated into the design for what became the Avro Lancaster. However, it was found that the Merlins left the Beaufighter underpowered and gave it a pronounced tendency to swing to port, making takeoffs and landings difficult and resulting in a high accident rate. Out of 337 Merlin-powered aircraft, 102 were lost to accidents. Due to wartime shortages, some Beaufighters were placed into operational service without equipment necessarily to feather the propellers, as some models of the twin-engined Beaufighter could not stay aloft on one engine unless the dead propeller was feathered. The lack of feathering equipment caused operational losses and deaths of aircrew. The Bristol Taurus engines of the Beaufort were not powerful enough for a fighter and were replaced by more powerful Bristol Hercules engines. The extra power presented problems with vibration. In the final design, they were mounted on long longer, more flexible struts, which extended from the front of the wings. This moved the center of gravity forward, an undesirable feature in aircraft design. It was moved back by shortening the nose, as no space was needed for a bomb aimer in a fighter. This put most of the fuselage behind the wing, and restored the cog to its proper location, with the engine cowlings and propellers now further forward than the tip of the nose. The Beaufighter had a characteristically stubby appearance. In general, apart from power plants, the differences between the Beaufort and Beaufighter were minor. The wings, control surfaces, retractable landing gear and aft section of the fuselage were identical to those of the Beaufort, while the wing center section was similar apart from certain fittings. The bomb bay was omitted, and 4 forward-firing 20mm Hispano Mk V cannons were mounted in the lower fuselage area. These were initially fed from 60-round drums, requiring the radar operator to change the ammunition drums manually, an arduous and unpopular task, especially at night and while chasing a bomber. As a result, they were soon replaced by a belt feed system. The cannons were supplemented by 6 303 Browning machine guns in the wings. This was one of the heavier, if not the heaviest, fighter armament of its time. When Beaufighters were developed as fighter torpedo bombers, they used the firepower to suppress flak fire and hit enemy ships, especially escorts and small vessels. The recoil of the cannons and machine guns could reduce the speed of the aircraft by around 25 knots when they fired. The areas for the rear gunner and bomb aimer were removed, leaving only the pilot in a fighter-type cockpit. The navigator radar operator sat to the rear under a small perspex bubble where the Beaufort's dorsal turret had been. Both crew members had their own hatch in the floor of the aircraft. The front hatch was behind the pilot's seat, as there was no room to climb around the seat back. The back collapsed to allow the pilot to climb over and into the seat. In an emergency, the pilot would operate a lever that remotely released the hatch, grasp 2 steel overhead tubes and lift himself out of his seat, swing his legs over the open hatchway, then let go to drop through. Evacuating the aircraft was easier for the navigator as the rear hatch was in front of him and without obstruction. Production of the Beaufort in Australia and the highly successful use of British-made Beaufighters by the Royal Australian Air Force led to Beaufighters being built by the Australian Department of Aircraft Production from 1944 onwards. The DAP's variant was an attack and torpedo bomber known as the Mark Chapter 21. Design changes included Hercules 7 or 18 engines and some minor changes in armament. By the time British production lines shut down in September 1945, 5,564 Beaufighters had been built in Britain by Bristol and also by the Ferry Aviation Company at Stockport and RAF Ringway, also by the Ministry of Aircraft Production and Routes at Speke. When Australian production ceased in 1946, 365 Mk-21s had been built. Operational service. By fighter standards, the Beaufighter Mk I was rather heavy and slow. It had an all-up weight of 16,000 pounds and a maximum speed of only 335 miles per hour at 16,800 feet. Nevertheless, this was all that was available at the time in Great Britain, as further production of the Westland Whirlwind had already been stopped due to problems with production of its Rolls-Royce Peregrine engines. The first Beaufighter was delivered to RAF Tangmere for trials with the Fighter Interception Unit on 12 August 1940, and the first operational machines were received by 29 Squadron and 600 104 Squadron on the 2nd of September. The Beaufighter came off the production line at almost exactly the same time as the first British airborne interception night fighter radar sets, with the 420mm cannons mounted in the lower fuselage. The nose could accommodate the radar antennas, and while early airborne interception equipment was too bulky to fit in single-engine fighters of the day, this was not a problem with the spacious fuselage of the Beaufighter. Even loaded to 20,000 pounds, the aircraft was fast enough to catch German bombers. By early 1941, it was an effective counter to Luftwaffe night raids. The various early models of the Beaufighter soon commenced service overseas, where its ruggedness and reliability quickly made the aircraft popular with crews, although it was heavy on the controls and not easy to fly, good landings being a particular challenge. A night fighter Mk V was supplied to squadrons in March 1942, equipped with AI Mark 8 radar, as the faster de Havilland Mosquito took over in the night fighter role in mid to late 1942. The heavier Beaufighter made valuable contributions in other areas such as anti-shipping, ground attack and long-range interdiction, in every major theater of operations. In the Mediterranean, the USAAF's 414th, 415th, 416th and 417th Night Fighter Squadrons received 100 Beaufighters in the summer of 1943, achieving the first victory in July 1943. Through the summer the squadrons conducted both daytime convoy escort and ground attack operations, but primarily flew defensive interception missions at night, although the Northrop P-61 Black Widow fighter began to arrive in December 1944. USAAF Beaufighters continued to fly night operations in Italy and France until late in the war. By the autumn of 1943, the Mosquito was available in enough numbers to replace the Beaufighter as the primary night fighter of the RAF. By the end of the war, some 70 pilots serving with RAF units had become aces while flying Beaufighters. At least one captured Beaufighter was operated by the Luftwaffe. A photograph exists of the aircraft in flight with German markings. Coastal Command 1941 saw the development of the Beaufighter Mk.It long-range heavy fighter. This new variant entered service in May 1941 with a detachment from No. 252 Squadron operating from Malta. The aircraft proved so effective in the Mediterranean against shipping, aircraft and ground targets that Coastal Command became the major user of the Beaufighter, replacing the now obsolete Beaufort and Blenheim. Coastal Command began to take delivery of the uprated Mk V in mid-1942. By the end of 1942, Mk Vics were being equipped with torpedo-carrying gear, enabling them to carry the British 18-in of the US 22.5-in torpedo externally. Observers were not happy about carrying the torpedo as they were unable to use the escape hatch until the torpedo was dropped. The first successful torpedo attacks by Beaufighters came in April 1943, with No. 254 Squadron sinking 2 merchant ships off Norway. The Hercules Mk-17, developing 1,735 horsepower at 500 feet, was installed in the Mk Vic airframe to produce the Tf-X, commonly known as the Turbo. The Mk-X became the main production mark of the Beaufighter. The strike variant of the Turbo was designated the Mk-XIC. Beaufighter Tf-X's would make precision attacks on shipping at wave top height with torpedoes or 60 pounds. RP-3 rockets. Early models of the Mk-X's carried centimetric wavelength ASV radar with herringbone antennae carried on the nose and outer wings, but this was replaced in late 1943 by the centimetric AI Mark 8 radar housed in a thimble-nose radome, enabling all-weather and night attacks. The Northcotes Strike Wing of Coastal Command, based at RAF Northcotes on the Lincolnshire coast, developed tactics which combined large formations of Beaufighters using cannons and rockets to suppress flak while the turbos attacked at low level with torpedoes. These tactics were put into practice in mid-1943, and in a 10-month period, 29,762 tons of shipping were sunk. Tactics were further adapted when shipping was moved from port during the night. Northcotes Strike Wing operated as the largest anti-shipping force of the Second World War, and accounted for over 150,000 tons of shipping and 117 vessels, for a loss of 120 Beaufighters and 241 aircrew killed or missing. This was half the total tonnage sunk by all strike wings between 1942 and 1945. Pacific War. The Beaufighter arrived at squadrons in Asia and the Pacific in mid-1942. It has often been said, although it was originally a piece of RAF whimsy quickly taken up by a British journalist, that Japanese soldiers referred to the Beaufighter as whispering death, supposedly because attacking aircraft often were not heard until it was too late. The Beaufighter's Hercules engines used sleeve valves which lacked the noisy valve gear common to pop-but valve engines. This was most apparent in a reduced noise level at the front of the engine. Southeast Asia. In the Southeast Asian theatre, the Beaufighter Mk V operated from India as a night fighter and on operations against Japanese lines of communication in Burma and Thailand. Mark 10 Beaufighters were also flown on long-range daylight intruder missions over Burma. The high-speed, low-level attacks were very effective despite often atrocious weather conditions, and makeshift repair and maintenance facilities. Southwest Pacific. Before DAP Beaufighters arrived at Royal Australian Air Force units in the Southwest Pacific Theatre, the Bristol Beaufighter Mk was employed in anti-shipping missions. The most famous of these was the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, where they were used in a fire suppression role in a mixed force with USAAF Douglas A-20 Boston and North American B-25 Mitchell bombers. The No. 30 Squadron RAF Beaufighters flew in at mast height to provide heavy suppressive fire for the waves of attacking bombers. The Japanese convoy, under the impression that they were under torpedo attack, made the tactical error of turning the ships towards the Beaufighters, which inflicted severe damage on the ship's anti-aircraft guns, bridges and quers during strafing runs with the 420mm nose cannons and 6-wing-mounted 303 in machine guns. The Japanese ships were left exposed to mast-height bombing and skip bombing attacks by the U.S. medium bombers. 8 transports and 4 destroyers were sunk for the loss of 5 aircraft, including 1 Beaufighter. The role of the Beaufighters was recorded by the war correspondent and filmmaker Damien Pera, who flew standing behind the pilot of one of the No. 30 Squadron aircraft. Post-war. From late 1944, RAF Beaufighter units were engaged in the Greek Civil War, finally withdrawing in 1946. The Beaufighter was also used by the air forces of Portugal, Turkey, and the Dominican Republic. It was used briefly by the Israeli Air Force after some ex-RAF examples were clandestinely purchased in 1948. Many Mark Chapter 10 aircraft were converted to the target tug role post-war as the TT-10 and served with several RAF support units until 1960. The last flight of a Beaufighter in RAF service was by TT-10RD 761 from RAF Seletar on 12 May 1960. Variants: Beaufighter Mk V two-seat night fighter variant, Beaufighter Mk IC. The C stood for Coastal Command variant. Many were modified to carry bombs. Beaufighter Mk IF. However well the Beaufighter performed, the short Stirling bomber program by late 1941 had a higher priority for the Hercules engine, and the Rolls-Royce Merlin XX-powered Mk IF night fighter was the result. Beaufighter Mk III IV. The Mark III and Mark IV were to be Hercules and Merlin-powered Beaufighters with a new, slimmer fuselage, carrying an armament of 6 cannons and 6 machine guns that would give performance improvements. The necessary costs of making the changes to the production line led to the curtailing of the marks. Beaufighter Mk V. The Versus had a bolt-and-pull turret with 4 0.303 in machine guns mounted aft of the cockpit, supplanting 1 pair of cannons and the wing-mounted machine guns. Only 2 Mk Versus were built. When tested by the ANAMP AE, R2274 was capable of 302 miles per hour at 19,000 feet. Beaufighter Mk V. The Hercules returned with the next major version in 1942, the Mk V, which was eventually built to over 1,000 examples. Changes included a dihedral tailplane. Beaufighter Mk V Coastal Command version, similar to the Mk IC. Beaufighter Mk VIF. Night fighter equipped with AI Mark 8 radar. Beaufighter Mk V interim torpedo fighter version. Beaufighter Mk 7. Proposed Australian-built variant with Hercules 26 engines. Not built. Beaufighter Mk 8. Proposed Australian-built variant with Hercules 17 engines. Not built. Beaufighter Mk IX. Proposed Australian-built variant with Hercules 17 engines. Not built. Beaufighter Tf-X two-seat torpedo fighter aircraft, dubbed the Turbo. Hercules 17 engines with cropped superchargers improved low-altitude performance. The last major version was the MKX. The later production models featured a dorsal fin. Beaufighter MKX IC Coastal Command version of the MKX, with no torpedo gear. Beaufighter Mk12. The Australian-made DAP Beaufighter. Changes included Hercules CVII engines, 4 20mm cannons in the nose, 4 Browning, 15 in the wings, and the capacity to carry 8 5-in high-velocity aircraft rockets, 2 250-pound bombs, 2 500-pound bombs and 1 Mk13 torpedo. After the war, many RAF Beaufighters were converted into target tug aircraft. Beaufighter Australian experimental classes, twin Merlin engines, 40mm Bofors gun-fitted operators, survivors, museum display. Australia Beaufighter Mk 21A8-186 built in Australia in 1945. A8-186 saw service with no 22 Squadron RAF at the very end of World War II. After spending some years on a farm in New South Wales, it was bought in 1965 by the Camden Museum of Aviation, a private aviation museum at Camden Airport, Sydney, Australia. It was restored using parts gathered from a wide variety of sources and wears bow guns fill nose art. They also have a complete nose section that was found at of Sydney Railway Workshops and acquired by the museum. Beaufighter Mk 21A8-328. This Australian-built aircraft is displayed at the Australian National Aviation Museum near Melbourne as A8-39 AK. Completed on the day the Pacific War ended, it saw post-war service as a target tug. Beaufighter Mk 21A8-386 nose sectioned only, displayed with Harry's baby nose art. United Kingdom Beaufighter Tf-X Rd 253 displayed at the Royal Air Force Museum in London. This aircraft flew with Portuguese Air Force's Bf-13 in the late 1940s. It was used as an instructional airframe before its return to the UK in 1965. Restoration was completed in 1968, using components scavenged from a wide variety of sources, including some parts recovered from a crash site. Beaufighter Tf-X Rd 220. This aircraft is currently displayed while under restoration at the National Museum of Flight at East Fortune Airfield, east of Edinburgh. Post-war, it served with the Portuguese Naval Air Arm. After passing through the hands of the Portuguese Museu do Ar and the South African Air Force Museum, it was acquired by National Museum Scotland in 2000. United States Beaufighter Mk ICA 19-43 on public display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, Dayton, Ohio since October 2006. Although flown in combat in the Southwest Pacific by 31 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force, A 19-43 is painted as T5049. Nightmare, a USAAF Beaufighter flown by Captain Harold Augsburger, commander of the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, who shot down a Heinkel He-111 carrying German staff officers in September 1944. The Beaufighter was recovered from a dump at Neil, Australia, in 1971, where it had been abandoned in 1947. It was acquired by the USAF Museum in 1988. Under restoration, stored Beaufighter Tf-X Rd 867 under storage at Canada Aviation Museum. Rd 867 awaits restoration. It is a semi-complete RAF restoration but lacks engines, cowlings or internal components. It was received from the RAF Museum in exchange for a Bristol bowling brick in 1969. Beaufighter Mk ICA 19-144 owned by the Fight Collection at Duxford. This aircraft has been undergoing a lengthy restoration to flying status for some years. It is a composite aircraft built using parts from JM 135 A-19-144 and JL 946 A-19-148. A number of sunken aircraft are known. In 2005, the wreck of a Beaufighter was identified about 0.5-mile off the north coast of Malta. The aircraft ditched in March 1943 after an engine failure occurred soon after takeoff and lies inverted on the seabed in 38 meters of water. Another Mediterranean wreck lies in 34 meters of water near the Greek island of Paros. This is possibly Beaufighter Tf-X LX 998 of 603 Squadron, which was shot down after destroying a German Arado R-196 during an anti-shipping mission in November 1943. The Australian crew survived and were rescued by a British submarine. AMK Vic Beaufighter, serial A19-130, lies in 204 feet of water, just off the coast of Ferguson Island in the Western Pacific. It was lost in almost identical circumstances to the Malta aircraft. It ditched in August 1943 after an engine failure soon after takeoff. The aircraft sank within seconds, but all three crew escaped and swam to shore. The wreck was located in 2000. The Midland Air Museum, Coventry, England has a Beaufighter cockpit section on public display. Its identity is thought possibly to be T5298. Specifications: Data from Jane's fighting aircraft of World War II. General characteristics: crew 2, pilot, observer, length 41 feet 4 in, wingspan 57 feet 10 in, height 15 feet 10 in, wing area 503 feet squared. Empty weight 15,592 pounds. Max takeoff weight 25,400 pounds. Power plant 2 times Bristol Hercules 14-cylinder radial engines, 1,600 horsepower each. Performance: maximum speed 320 miles per hour at 10,000 feet. Range 1,750 miles. Service ceiling 19,000 feet without torpedo. Rate of climb 1,600 feet per minute without torpedo. Armament: guns 4 times 20 mm Hispano Mk2 cannon in nose, 1 times manually operated, 303 in Browning for observer. External loads: 2 times 250 pounds bombs or 1 times British 18-inch torpedo or 1 times Mark Chapter 13 torpedo or 8 times RP3 60 pounds rockets.